Hello and welcome to In Solidarity. I'm your host, James Battershill. Before we get going with today's episode, just a quick content warning. This episode includes discussions of sexual assault, rape, and trauma.
For me, all I can describe this from them is kind of a performative feminism, because in my experience, that's just not been the case for them. When it comes down to it, the survivor will not be put before their own image or their own brand.
On In Solidarity, we often cover important topics like this one that deserve discussion, but unfortunately, they also tend to be very algorithm unfriendly, which means that episodes can end up getting completely buried. So today, more than ever, I would like to really encourage you to share this episode with your friends, family, co-workers, basically anyone who you think needs to hear it. Big business and advertisers shouldn't be the ones who get to set the agenda on what's okay to talk about. So please help us get this episode heard. In the modern world, every problem that exists seems to have an entrepreneurial tech company looking to deliver the solution. And in today's case, the problem they're attempting to solve is sexual violence and the epidemic of it that we have in England and Wales. The majority of victims here will never go to the police, and our cripplingly slow criminal justice system sees less than 2% of cases ending up with a guilty verdict. One of the proposed solutions to this is called Enough, and it is a self-described revolutionary platform that is currently being offered to university students in Bristol. However, there are those who have concerns about both the platform and the behaviour of its representatives.
A lot of people at university, their experience with sexual violence isn't just this kind of clean cut at university, someone that they've kind of come into contact with on a night out, and then a self-swab kit is going to save them.
And that is why I'm joined today by Sian Norris. She is an investigative reporter at openDemocracy and author of Bodies Under Siege, How the Far-Right Attack on Reproductive Rights Went Global. And Lucy H. Watson, a student at Bristol University. Lucy, Sian, welcome to the show. So Sian, let's start with, what is Enough?
So Enough is a company project campaign aimed mostly at students with this aim of deterring rape on campus, rape and sexual violence on campus. And its main offering is that students can access these free self-swab DNA kits. And the DNA kits you can use after a rape or a sexual assault. Take a DNA swab from your vagina, your mouth, or your anus, and then send that back to Enough, who will send it to a lab, which will analyze the DNA swab to see if there's a second set of DNA on it. At the same time, they also offer what they call a reporting platform, where people can share online testimonials of their experiences of rape and sexual assault. And they offer a series of what they call recovery resources, which are short videos by a counsellor talking about ways in which to deal with the trauma of sexual assault. And those recovery resources offer things like little tips on what to do if you've been triggered, or advice on kind of the rape myths or framing of sexual assault in society. So that's the kind of basic setup of this organisation. And Lucy, I was wondering, did you want to say something else?
So yeah, Enough has stood kind of outside a prominent university attempting to divert traffic towards themselves from students moving from lecture to lecture or in between study spaces to kind of promote their rape kits and ensure that their brand is kind of very prolific throughout the university.
Sian, if we come back to you for a second here, what brought to your attention that Enough needed looking at?
I was contacted by someone in the women's sector in Bristol who had some concerns about Enough's methodology. She was concerned about the admissibility of the DNA self-swab kits in particular. The idea that taking a swab of DNA on your own in your own home and then it being used to determine whether there was a second set of DNA, while is a kind of innovative and interesting idea on the one hand, it doesn't necessarily prove that there was a rape or a sexual assault. And this was kind of the main concern that was being flagged. But they also had some concerns about the general attitudes of the organisation. I was told about organisations being sent cease and desist letters for criticising Enough, and also that there was concerns about the reporting mechanism and the recovery resources and whether they were fully trauma informed. And so I thought, well, this is interesting. There's obviously a lot of good intentions in this, but is it really what it seems? And that's what made me decide to start investigating.
Okay, so we have this startup selling tech as a solution to sexual assault. Sounds fairly unique, but has this been attempted anywhere else in the world?
This was one of the most intriguing aspects of the Enough story. So when I spoke to my original source, she raised the fact that there was a US organization called Leda Health, which had offered self-swab DNA kits as a kind of tech startup in the US. And the founder was this young woman called Madison Campbell. And really interestingly and kind of horrifyingly, she described sexual assault as a multi-billion-dollar industry. Now, as someone who has spent most of my adult life campaigning about and writing about issues of sexual violence, the idea that it would be considered an industry was absolutely shocking to me. Now, what the Leda Health model was doing was very similar to Enough. It was offering young people, or well, really anyone, but with a kind of focus on youth, self-swab DNA kits which could be used to determine a second set of DNA following a sexual assault or a rape. But it seemed to go very, very badly wrong. Various attorney generals across the US were sending cease and desist letters against Leda Health because they said it was misleading victims of sexual violence regarding its admissibility of these kits in court. Now, Tom Allchurch, who was one of the co-founders of Enough, was involved in Leda Health, according to an article in The Cut magazine. And he was a sort of unofficial advisor, an unpaid advisor to their campaign. He's, as I say, one of the co-founders of Enough. But when you look at anything that Enough has said about where they've come from or about the existence of these kits in other spaces, they never mention the Leda Health scheme. And I thought that was really interesting because surely if it's been tried in the US and really didn't seem to work, that is something that people need to know about this attempt in the UK.
Interesting. So, because these kits have been around in some form in the past, have they ever been used in any successful prosecutions?
As far as I know, no. So, according to an article that was in The Cut, which is a US publication and came out in 2023, by that point, none of the swab kits offered by Leda Health had been used successfully in a criminal prosecution. And so far, the same applies for Enough, although Enough is very clear that they are not trying to offer a criminal justice deterrence. They're trying to offer what they call a social deterrence to rape and sexual violence. But when we think about the role that these kits could play in a criminal prosecution, it becomes really complicated really quickly. Because yes, while a swab can prove that a second set of DNA is present on someone's body, it does not prove whether consent was absent. And the majority of criminal trials when it comes to rape and sexual violence in Britain and in the UK hinge on that idea of whether or not consent can be proven. Now, a DNA swab just does not tell you that. It doesn't mean that it can't be useful. It doesn't mean that it's not part of a story, but it's not going to kind of give you a conviction without any other evidence around consent or around sort of additional violence or additional injury. And I think, again, that's one of the major concerns that people have raised about Enough. When someone is raped, them and they go to a sexual assault referral centre or to the police, there is other evidence that is collected in that moment that goes far beyond DNA. But at the moment, what Enough offers is a second set of DNA evidence and the potential to write a sort of online testimony, which is not the same as the evidence collection that you would get in a different setting.
So, Enough is out in the wild now, so to speak. Lucy, you're a student at Bristol University and you've come into direct contact with Enough on at least one occasion. What was the tipping point for you that made you feel like you had to say something about this company?
I've always had a sour taste in my mouth about Enough. I would never say there was a point where they came on my radar when I think about it, because they were just always present. The second I kind of showed up for my second year uni, their posters were everywhere. They were outside uni buildings. And I'd always disliked a lot of their language and their messaging, like "this is enough to end rape," which is their kind of full tagline. Because I just thought it was so reductionist of such a complex issue. And a lot of people at university, their experience with sexual violence isn't just this kind of clean cut at university, someone that they've kind of come into contact with on a night out, and then a self-swab kit is going to save them. It's kind of looking at their history, child sexual abuse, it's in partnerships that exist, all these kind of things that self-swab kits didn't seem to me to be like the right fit. So I kind of found their messaging to be insensitive and quite arrogant. Then I had my own interaction with them in January where they kind of, I was approached on the street when I was very drunk and kind of didn't fully appreciate what was going on. I was definitely too drunk to consent to being filmed, which was what was happening. And about 6 or 7 enough representatives were there filming themselves, giving me a rape kit, putting a wristband on me about enough. And I felt very violated from the incident. And I kind of just sat on all of it because it felt like something that I didn't want to be the person to kind of say, oh, like this initiative is bad. It was under everyone's impression that it was a kind of a charity, that it was student led. It felt like it would be quite like mean almost to say like, I don't agree with enough. I think something's going wrong here. And then in April, it was when I started reading the news coverage of it. And I read articles like the one in the Cut about Leda Health and about Madison Campbell. And when I started reading about how Enough was kind of a business being run by business people that didn't have any connection to the University of Bristol. And I really wanted students to make sure that they knew as well that this kind of, that they could speak up and they could say, I don't agree with Enough, because they couldn't, Enough shouldn't be able to hide behind this idea that they're this grassroots student thing when they're not.
If we just walk back in time to your experience in January, this is obviously a really sensitive subject. And from what you've seen on campus, is Enough dealing with this with the sensitivity that rape and sexual assault require?
I suppose as a Bristol student, I just find that question funny. Like looking at my experience, I couldn't even in any good faith say that I've seen any sensitivity extended to the issue of sexual assault from my experience or anyone I've spoken to experience with Enough. I mean, other companies market outside of buildings to students, like energy drinks company, and I think they have been nicer than my experience with Enough, which is laughable when it's such a kind of triggering, traumatic, complex issue. I mean, in my case, I was never asked, are you okay? Do you want to be filmed? Like, can I have a moment of your time? It was immediately, I was swarmed, outnumbered. I felt like I could not say no. And yet again, I was too drunk to even give any kind of consent. And looking back at all of it, I just was so baffled that this was a company that kind of was talking about issues like consent when they kind of clearly weren't exercising that in their kind of day-to-day interactions with people. And I've spoken to a lot of people who have walked away from experiences with Enough kind of distressed and feeling incredibly vulnerable and hurt, and feeling like there was no channel from which they could say, like, I have been hurt by this company. Many of them, they think it's even a charity.
Sian, what is exactly the plan here? Like, is this offering on the table something that isn't available elsewhere? Is it a unique solution?
In some ways, the Enough, if we can call it a solution, is unique in that it's offering something that hasn't really been done before in the UK. But the idea of DNA and evidence collection after a rape or sexual assault, of course, is not unique. And there are mechanisms in place to support victims and survivors in the aftermath of a serious incident. So, if you are raped or sexually assaulted in Bristol, we are really lucky that we have a sexual assault referral centre, which was set up a few years ago. I mean, I remember it being set up because I was involved in the feminist movement. And when you go to a sexual assault referral centre, they will do a forensic examination. So they will take DNA swabs, but they'll also have people on hand who can offer counselling or mental health support. They'll have people on hand who can check for, as I say, other forms of injury. So if there's bruising or, tearing, they'll be able to bear witness to the fact that you might be distressed or traumatized. And so that's one of the services that we have. We also have, of course, the police. Now, I have spent much of my career reporting on the many failings of the police when it comes to sexual violence. We know that there are many, many reasons why women very understandably and rightly do not want to go to the police. But again, if you do go to the police, they will do this forensic examination. They will be able to take down evidence, and they will have that kind of broader, holistic evidence collection that taking a DNA self-swab kit on your own won't do. Now, as I say, Enough does not consider itself to be an alternative to the police or the SARC. It does direct people to the police and the SARC, but it says that it gives women or men or as victims and survivors a chance to acknowledge that something bad has happened to them via the self-swab kit. and that by collecting that evidence, people are able to take some control back. That's their argument. Again, I don't know if that's the experience of some of the women that I've spoken to. One victim survivor that I spoke to said that she found the kits really problematic because she felt that they were isolating, and that in that moment, women don't want to be taking a swab of their vagina alone in this discreet setting. They're very hot on saying that it's about doing it discreetly, which, again, some women would appreciate that, and other women disagree with the idea that you need to be discreet. But what I find really interesting is that there's been so much discussion about the kits and a lot of criticism of the kits, and this issue about the fact that they may not be admissible, that they do not allow you to collect the wide range of evidence that might be needed, that they do not prove consent, they just prove presence of DNA, but that enough is sticking with the kits. And it seems to me that there are so many different ways in which a vibrant youth-centered campaign could be working to tackle sexual violence, that this idea of kind of being married to the kits is bizarre, because there are different ways that we can talk about this issue, and I don't really understand why we're not using those ones.
So these swabs are being collected discreetly, but I suppose the question is, if the overall service is offering visibility to a problem, is it not therefore offering visibility to victims as well?
Anything that gets people talking about rape and sexual violence is a positive step. And I think one of the women that I spoke to who was very supportive of Enough said that it actually helped raise awareness of things like the Sexual Assault Referral Centre that wasn't available before. That the fact that there was a conversation happening meant that people knew about the SARC when perhaps they didn't know about the SARC before. But I guess, Lucy, it'd be interesting to get your perspective on this as well, because you're at the university. Like, how has it helped with visibility?
I think Enough are very keen to say that they've kind of put SARCs first, and that they've kind of promoted them in a way that they haven't had exposure to before. But I don't think that's been the actual experience for any student at the University of Bristol. I mean, not anyone that I've spoken to or myself. It's kind of been so dominating that a lot of people assume that Enough is kind of part of the official kind of set of systems, that they don't know what a SARC is, and they assume that if they are a victim of a sexual assault, they should go to Enough because that's the only example of DNA collecting they know of. So if that's something that they want to pursue, they've already got the kits, but given to them already. And so that's the avenue that they're going down. I think it's an incredibly bold claim to say they've raised the visibility of SARCs, and especially because, I've been following Enough for such a long time out of this kind of morbid curiosity almost and real concern about them. And they've changed a lot of their messaging around their SARCs and their relationship with SARCs and their promotion of SARCs. Because they now say in their comment section or in official communication, we always say go to a SARC first. But originally they were, if anyone commented saying like, oh, actually, I think SARCs are a better option than what you're promoting here, it was a kind of clapback that they kind of repeatedly used. And I saw repeatedly throughout their Instagram of like 5 and 6 people don't want to go to SARCs. And so it was actually saying like, well, you think SARCs are good, we think they're rubbish. Behind the scenes, they're still very strong in their kind of dismissal of SARCs, and they'll still toe their official line that they've adopted now that, SARCs, we promote SARCs, we raise awareness of SARCs. But they've said in emails to me about how there's this dark side to SARCs. They've said in messaging with another University of Bristol student, Will White, who writes for a student newspaper, that the admissibility argument is actually the product of SARCs, that they've kind of come up with that for the purposes of more funding. So I think Enough are kind of having a laugh when they say that they have been a positive force in relationship to sexual assault referral centres and to the Bridge and to people's understanding of those services in Bristol.
The claim that these kits will deter sexual assault if they're widely used on campuses is, it's a huge claim. Is there any evidence to back this up, though?
Obviously, I don't conduct surveys, but as a student who knows a lot of students, I'm involved in a lot of societies. I kind of have spoken to so many people as part of this campaign. I haven't had a single person say that they feel safer or they feel that the presence of enough has changed anything. And I've actually had people raise with me that they know of people on campus who are have been accused of sexual wrongdoing, who are currently being investigated, who are then simultaneously promoting enough. People see it more as a really easy way for men and for kind of generally for people to sanitize their image. It's a kind of gimmick. They can say, oh, I like enough. And we can all move on with our day. Whereas so many women have spoken to me and say they don't feel any change has been achieved. And it feels like a mockery for them to say that they've reduced sexual violence. Like, we've all been sitting around being okay with all of this sexual violence, and now someone's done something. Well done them. It feels, very self-congratulatory and in no way rooted in the real situation on campus.
And Sian, is there ever a legitimate use for these kits?
I guess the question isn't whether there's a legitimate use for the kits, because it's about how the kits are being presented. And I think, as Lucy's really importantly pointed out there, a lot of people don't seem to realise that this is a pilot. And I think when we've come to, working with rape victims, when we come to working with survivors of serious sexual assault and any kind of sexual violence, you're dealing with people who are very vulnerable and who are very traumatized and who are, for understandable reasons, want a solution. They want to feel that there's something that will help them. So it's not about whether the kits are legitimate. It's about whether or not the kind of structures in place are really going to support and help sexual violence survivors and victims. And I think that's a big question mark over enough. We have seen the use of self-swab kits in other contexts. I spoke to a researcher who launched a project in Kenya where the self-swab DNA kits were being used. But again, that was a very different context to campus sexual violence, because this was often where the violence was committed by strangers, potentially in a conflict situation, and where the DNA can be used to prove that something took place. And so, I think that's a sort of legitimate use, but in a very different situation, and that makes a difference. But I do continue to have really real concerns about the vulnerability of rape victims and survivors, and how the enough messaging is reaching them and what they believe can be achieved via the kits.
Could these kits be seen almost as a backup, I guess? So is there any harm in a victim using one of these kits at home and then down the line they decide, actually, I should go to the police?
This is a really important question, and I think it's one of the things that I was really concerned about the more I learned about Enough's project and the way in which it talks to victims and survivors. So yes, when you take the self-swab DNA kit that is given to you by Enough, it is kind of sold to you as a backup. You can take this kit, you can do the swab, you can find out if there's a second set of DNA in your body, or you will know that already because you will have been raped or sexually assaulted, but you can prove using the DNA self-swab kit that there is a second set of DNA, and you can then store that DNA swab for 20 years and it can be used later on. However, buried in the privacy policy, which one would say is not really the place to bury this kind of information, is a notice that says that if you then go to the police or you go to the SARC, any subsequent swabs may be compromised. Now, that's really important. That's not the wording that they use, but it's really important to understand that if you do this initial swab, it may affect any future swabs down the line. And I really think that should be something that's printed on the kits, to sort of give people that fair warning and not be put in a privacy policy. Now, I think we need to recognize that people, when you are raped or sexually assaulted, you are not suddenly an expert in rape and sexual assault. Nobody is born with this knowledge. And so it needs to be really, really clear what the restrictions are and what the potentials are of these kits, rather than that information be held on a privacy policy, which, to be quite frank, most people don't read the privacy policies on a website. I do, because that's where you can find out lots of information, but it's not the first port of call for most people when they go online.
When you mention privacy policies here, Sian, that kind of gets my slightly nerdy side alerted. Let's talk about data privacy for a second. So these swabs are being collected, and then I suppose they're sent off to enough where they end up on this database for up to 20 years. Do we know anything about how they're actually protecting this data?
So I'm not a data protection expert, but I did speak to some data protection experts in doing this investigation. And yeah, it is a question mark because you obviously are storing the DNA of a rape victim, but you're also storing the DNA of an alleged rape perpetrator. And also, when you submit your DNA kit, you fill out a form where you have the option to, write a report or write a testimony about what has happened to you. And in some cases, that can mean naming the alleged perpetrator. Now, there are exemptions of like storing data without the second person's consent when it's for a serious issue such as rape and sexual violence. So, they're not violating any kind of data protection on that. But there is, big question marks about what's being done with the person's data. And I think one of the things that has really concerned me as well is that, you're taking the DNA of someone that you've said has raped or harmed you, but that person can always just turn around and say, well, you just took my DNA. Like you took my DNA. It was consensual, but you took the DNA when I was asleep. Or, there's ways in which perpetrators very commonly try and allege false allegations against women. And I think, that is a concern if you're relying on a DNA swab.
And I'd like to raise as well that DNA is not the only GDPR issue that Enough has got going on. I've spoken to multiple ex-ambassadors who've told me that Enough have used the practice of creating spreadsheets with the names of students within the University of Bristol that they would like the contact information of. And they turn around to their student volunteers and told them, you need to collect these numbers for us. And whether that's through course group chats, society group chats, whether it's their own friend, they've been encouraged to en masse give up the data of their friends, of their course mates, of people they kind of vaguely know of, and for the purpose of Enough contacting them and promoting them. And I've spoken to students who have been contacted through this manner, and it's had a considerable impact on their mental health and well-being, feeling like their data is out and that companies know their name, know their number, and are kind of in their phone messaging them. I mean, in my case, the second I spoke out against Enough, they've got someone to get my number. And it's a violation of GDPR, and their volunteers that are doing this aren't aware of that. And I think that's it's astounding that they are kind of abusing these kind of well-meaning volunteers in this manner against their fellow friends and students.
So you mentioned volunteers there. What is the status of Enough? Is it a charity? Is it a business?
So Enough has two profiles on Companies House, which is the register for businesses and organisations in the UK. One of them is a limited company and one of them is a community interest company, which means it's a not-for-profit. They also have spoken in a slide deck that I saw via FOI laws about setting up a charitable foundation. But I think as well, it speaks to something that Lucy has said throughout this conversation, that a lot of students believe it's a charity or believe that it's a campaign. Now, Enough hasn't said that. It hasn't lied. It hasn't, pretended to be anything that it isn't. But I think people do need to understand that this is a business. It's a not-for-profit business, but it is a business.
So Enough has been rolled out at a university, but it's not endorsed by them. How exactly did Enough pitch this product to Bristol University?
I did a freedom of information request that gave me communications between the two Bristol universities and Enough, and that included a slide deck where it pitched itself as a solution to student well-being, but it would be a kind of partner of universities and bring the kits to students, but at a cost. It was asking the universities to invest in the product. And the universities rejected this. They didn't want to partner with Enough. And then since then, we've also seen approaches where they've said that they want to work with the government, where they want to work with police, where they want to sell the kits on Amazon, work with sixth form colleges, or work with pharmacies. So they're definitely thinking of different ways in which they can get the kits out there. But I think what was really interesting is, it is looking for university public sector investment to bring its kits to a bigger range of universities and to a bigger range of students.
It pictures itself as this revolutionary force, I guess you could say. But let's talk about your experience of that. So, how does that actually bear out in reality?
Yeah, I found it really quite grating for enough to kind of say that we're the first solution to put the survivor first, and everyone else is somehow celebrating the system. They're celebrating the survivor. Um, you know, for me, all I can describe this from them is kind of a performative feminism, because in my experience, that's just not been the case for them. When it comes down to it, the survivor will not be put before their own image or their own brand. So the first ever testimony I put on the account Enough of Enough was from a student who is herself a rape survivor, and that was discussed in the post, and how she said her experience with Enough was re-traumatizing. And within about an hour, 2 hours, Enough was in the comment section of that post, not only calling it misinformation, but saying that it was false allegations. And that's such loaded terminology to throw at a rape survivor. Um, you know, so they'll kind of say, like, we put the survivor first. That's what's special about us. But when the survivor kind of contradicts with what they've said, they'll completely abandon that ideology. Um, and it says so much about them, that kind of the impact they have on these people. So many people that have spoken to me and have had their stories shared are rape survivors, and enough to turn around and kind of in so many different avenues on their social media and communications with the press and communication with me to say, it's all this kind of all inaccurate. It's a hate account. It's misinformation. It's false. It's rumors. To kind of make it seem like this is a group of hysterical young women, kind of making things up for fun. Um, it's so frustrating when they turn around and say that they're this kind of special cause that care so much about survivors, who are the very same people where in these instances they've kind of chucked under the bus to save themselves.
Sounds like they've got almost a fiery attitude in communications. And from what you've said, you've received some almost, dare I say, disturbing communications from Enough. Sian, how does what you found in freedom of information requests reflect Lucy's experience?
I was really shocked when I reviewed the emails between Enough and the universities at the only word I could come to think of was belligerence. There was a real tone of voice where they said, you should be thanking us, you should be grateful for what we're doing. They had an email from a lawyer questioning the admissibility of the kits, and it was like, surely you know the rules of evidence. Interesting email from a lawyer. They raised the issue of free speech, that kind of not allowing Enough to be on campus was a free speech issue, and it just was quite surprising to me. And that they were just quite, again, belligerent, and it was quite sarcastic.
Okay, so for the final question, we ask this of everyone who comes on the show. Lucy, what does solidarity mean to you?
I think for me, solidarity is about not only platforming a kind of the people that need to have their voices heard, but really taking the time to understand why they're speaking up and how you can kind of support them in that. I've made in Enough of Enough, I kind of sought to make a platform for people to share their testimonies that otherwise haven't been heard. But it's been important that it's never been kind of my story to tell, and I've never been a gotcha moment in any of my speaking with people. All of my posts that use the words of students and survivors are all approved by them and seen by them. Everyone has the chance to edit it or ask for it to change their mind and withdraw their consent. So for me, in my work around Enough and with my fellow students, solidarity has been taking the time to listen and not considering yourself to be the smartest person or the wisest one in any kind of conversation.
In Solidarity was produced by James Battershill, Ayodeji Rotinwa, and Carla Abreu. The theme song was Odyssey by Edward Abella. If you enjoyed today's episode and you would like to help support us in making more, you can do so by heading to opendemocracy.net/donate. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.